Quran says, slay the infidels. Now, the Muslims have had historically many empires, the Umayyad, the Abbasid, the Ottoman Empire. The Muslims ruled northern India for 200 years. They ruled about 40 million Hindus. They could have slain them. They could have killed them. They could have forced them to convert. They did nothing of the sort. So what I'm getting at here is we're getting, if you will, a certain kind of, let's read the Quran and pick out a passage without looking at how these passages have actually been interpreted through Islamic history. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that there aren't problems with Islamic teaching. I am simply saying that this root and branch attack on Islam, the Prophet Muhammad was the founder of terrorism. The Quran is a gospel of violence. We are setting up to have a war with 1 billion Muslims. That is a very stupid war to fight. It's an unnecessary war. It's the wrong war.
Unfortunately,
Mr. Spencer, let me ask you a question, and you can maybe incorporate your answer into both.
I will.
If in looking at, right now we are faced with an enemy that we must destroy, but in looking at different instances of the history, we see the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka. They were the first to engage in suicide bombing. In 1946, there was a King David bombing where terrorists killed over 90 people, including Jews, Arabs, Christians, and British soldiers there. We see terrorism, of course, between Catholics and Protestants in Ireland. Would those be characterized as Catholic terrorism or Hindu terrorism or Jewish terrorism?
Thank you for the question, because this is a common thing that is said. Actually, no, they would not be characterized as Catholic or Jewish or Hindu terrorism, precisely because the people who carry out the acts of terrorism in those instances do not adduce the religious texts of their respective religions to justify their actions. Whereas the Islamic terrorists do that, and they do that in great detail. Once again, Mr. D'Souza has brushed past my point about the teachings of Islam. I am talking precisely about what he says we ought to be talking about, and that is how these texts have been interpreted throughout Islamic history. Unfortunately for Mr. D'Souza, these passages that I supposedly cherry-pick out of the Quran that are violent are the ones, precisely the ones, that in traditional and mainstream Islamic theology, according to the doctrine of nasikh or abrogation, are considered to cancel out the peaceful verses and leave the jihad warfare imperative as the word for all time. Now, that doesn't mean that every Muslim is going to be following that out, but that is mainstream Islamic teaching. This is a matter of record. Look at the Islamic text yourself.
All right, this time we're getting close to the end, so I'm going to offer, if you'd wait for a second, Mr. D'Souza, I'm going to offer each of you a 2-minute closing.
I just want to rebut his.
Well, maybe if you include that in your closing, and then we'll have a 1-minute rebuttal to the closing. You want to go first then, Mr. D'Souza?
I'm sorry. Well, can I answer him before doing my closing? Because otherwise I'll use up my closing swatting him down.
Well, so, I have to be fair.
All right.
You have 2 minutes.
Look, we agree that there is a problem with the Islamic radicals using the Quran to justify their deeds. We also agree that this group has become very powerful in the Muslim world. That's a real danger. Spencer admits, he'll say, well, not every Muslim, as though there are 3 Muslims who have not yet joined radical Islam. There are, in fact, many Muslims who have not. Now, I ask you this, Spencer, if those guys were in this room listening to you denouncing Muhammad as the founder of terrorism, attacking the Quran, wouldn't the effect of your books collectively be to polarize those guys, push them away from American conservatism, and push them closer to the Islam? You're basically saying that the only good Muslim is a non-Muslim.
It's easy to set up a straw man and knock it down. It's harder to deal with what I'm actually saying. Now, the fact is that I never said Muhammad was the founder of terrorism. To say that would be asinine. But Muhammad did mandate warfare against unbelievers. It's in the Quran also. And it is abundantly clear from the teachings of all the schools of Islamic jurisprudence. Now, what does that mean that we should do? Should we avoid saying anything about this in order to keep from offending the sensibilities of Muslims? It would seem to me that on the basis of simple human decency, as well as simple adherence to reality, we ought to be calling upon Muslims of goodwill to examine these elements of Islam that are giving rise to violence and to repudiate them and to adhere to the canons of human rights that are universally accepted in the world, even in large parts of the Islamic world. And then, in other words, to look at the texts of the Quran and the example of Muhammad is not insulting or disrespectful. It is a matter that any sincere Islamic reformer would be completely behind, because obviously you cannot reform something that you won't admit needs reforming and that you won't acknowledge needs careful examination. And so the idea that these people abhor jihad, but if you talk about Muhammad, then they will become jihadists, is completely silly. If they really abhor jihad, then no matter how insulted they are, they're not going to join it. And so Mr. D'Souza's own argument illustrates the fact that there is widespread support for this, unfortunately, among his so-called traditional Muslims, like the Grand Mufti of Egypt. And so I am calling for Muslims of goodwill, like my friend Ahmed Yunus in the crowd here, and others, to honestly discuss the elements of Islam that are inspiring the jihad terrorists, that Osama bin Laden is quoting, that all the others are quoting all the time, and making recruits among Mr. D'Souza's traditional Muslims on that basis, and to come up with some positive way, instead of denying that these elements exist, come up with some positive way to deal with them so that we can live in peaceful accord.
Somewhat like the mosquito in the nudist colony, I'm trying to decide where to begin. But look, it seems to me that Spencer is, on the one hand, claiming something, and with the other hand, taking it back. Who are these traditional Muslims? That's what seems to be the heart of the matter here. To read Spencer's books, you would think most of these Muslims are radicals. They read the Quran. It fires them up. I have read them. Look, you're always interrupting me. Most Muslims in the world today live in democratic societies. If that surprises you a little bit, it's because you've never read it in Spencer's books. The largest Muslim country in the world is Indonesia, a democracy. There are Muslims in Turkey, which is another democracy. India is democratic. My point is simply this, that we are having debates. Is Islam compatible with democracy when the majority of Muslims today are running in elections, stepping down when they lose, and so on? My point is these are people that we can work with. The radical Muslims are courting them. We don't want to push them away, because ultimately, even if we kill 1,000 radical Muslims, it's no good if 10,000 traditional Muslims sign up the next week. I am saying that as conservatives, if we were winning this war, you could say, why are we listening to a new strategy? We're not doing that well. We are bringing very few converts in from the left, and we are increasing anti-Muslim sentiment, which the radical Muslims are exploiting over there. So I think that conservatives, or some of us, have been unintelligently fighting this war, and by understanding it better, I think we can fight it better. Thank you.
That brings our debate to a close. I want to end with a verse from Matthew 5:9. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the sons of God. Thank you for your attention today, and I hope that you have something to think about. God bless you.